On the day of her funeral, my son looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're not part of this family anymore, and you're not getting a cent." That was how it began. No hug, no shared grief, just a door slammed shut between a father and his only child, and behind it, a silence colder than the grave we'd just stood over. I hadn't spoken much at the service. I stood off to the side, watching strangers cry over the woman I once shared a life with. Her name was Evelyn, my ex-wife. We divorced 15 years ago, but time didn't erase the years we spent building a life together, raising a son, laughing in kitchens, fighting in hallways, trying, failing, healing. I never stopped caring about her. Even after the papers were signed, even after she remarried, I showed up when she got sick. Cancer doesn't care about history, and when it came for her, I came too. I brought groceries, drove her to chemo, sat beside her when no one else did, including him. Our son, Michael, he never forgave the divorce. He stayed with her, physically and emotionally. And Evelyn, perhaps out of pain, perhaps pride, let him believe I had walked away from both of them. I didn't, but resentment makes fertile soil for lies, and he let them grow. The call came late the night after Christmas. I remember because I'd just put away the last of the lights. My phone buzzed, unknown number, but I recognized his voice instantly. "Dad," he said, flat and unfeeling, "Mom passed away last night." There was no crack in his voice, no hesitation, just cold delivery, like a message read off a screen. I'm sorry," I whispered. How are you holding up?" He didn't answer that. Instead, after a pause that felt like a blade being pulled back, "Don't expect anything from her will. She left you nothing." That's all I called to say. And then a click. No goodbye, no closure, just a dial tone ringing like judgment in my ear. I sat in the dark for hours, not moving, not breathing, not fully sure what hurt more, that she was gone, or that my own son called to tell me I didn't matter, not even now. But I knew Evelyn, and I knew that wasn't the full story. I just didn't know then how much she remembered, or how loud the truth would one day laugh in his face. And so I showed up, to the reading of the will, not for the money, but to find out if she had truly erased me, or if, in the quiet moments he never saw, she had left something no inheritance could buy. The truth. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your life? If this story touches your heart, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and continue telling stories that matter. All right, let's continue. They say time heals, but sometimes time just hides the wound under nicer clothes. Evelyn and I had been divorced for over 15 years, long enough for most people to forget we were ever a we, long enough for friends to fade, for photos to be taken off the shelves, for my name to disappear from holiday cards, but not long enough for me to stop caring. When she got sick, I heard through a neighbor, not our son, not family, just someone who'd seen her walking slower, looking thinner, and thought I should know. I remember standing in the middle of the kitchen, the sound of that message still ringing in my ears. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone, then drove to her house. She didn't slam the door in my face. That's not who Evelyn was. She just stared at me, eyes hollow from exhaustion. "You came?" she said quietly. And I did, again and again, through chemotherapy, through nights of nausea and silence, through doctor appointments she didn't want to attend alone. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just couldn't pretend she didn't matter. Not after everything we'd lived through. Not even after the divorce. But if I was present in those moments, I was invisible in every other way. Her new circle of friends, colleagues from the charity board, neighbors who only knew her post-divorce, even some extended family. They looked at me like a ghost, a relic, someone whose story ended years ago. I would sit quietly in the corner during treatment check-ins while they filled the room with polite smiles and hollow words. They didn't ask how I was doing, didn't ask why I was there. Maybe they didn't even know. But the worst was our son. Michael had grown into a man with sharp words and a colder heart. Somewhere along the way, he built a wall between us, one that I could never climb. He believed the version of events that painted me as the man who left, who gave up. He never saw the nights I sat in my car outside their house after work, too ashamed to knock. He never heard the voicemails I left when he stopped answering. Evelyn, in her pain, had rewritten the story, and Michael carried that script like gospel. He didn't just believe I was gone. He made sure everyone else believed it too. When I showed up to help, he'd roll his eyes. When I brought groceries, he'd mutter that I was trying to buy redemption. When I sat with Evelyn, he'd leave the room. One night, after I stayed late to help her sleep, I heard him in the hallway, whispering to a friend on the phone. "He still thinks he matters," he said with a cruel chuckle. "He's just doing this to make himself feel better. She's not leaving him anything." That wasn't why I was there. I didn't need money. I needed to believe that somewhere, beneath all the hurt, we still had some connection as family. But slowly, painfully, I began to realize that in their world, I had been erased. Not forgotten. Erased. And when I sat in that lawyer's office days after Evelyn's death, staring at the man my son had become, I feared the last piece of me she still carried had died with her. But fate and love have a way of speaking from beyond the grave, and the silence they gave me was about to be broken. The wake was held in the old church Evelyn used to volunteer at, the one with tall windows that let in too much light for a day like that. Grief, after all, should sit in shadow. I arrived early, not to be seen, just to be near her, one last time. I sat in the back pew, alone, watching, listening, remembering. The front of the church was covered in framed photographs. Her smile lit up everyone. Evelyn laughing in the garden, Evelyn at a gala, Evelyn holding our son when he was small, though I was cropped out of the edges. In some photos, it was almost comical how obviously I'd been removed, like a ghost edited out of his own life, and in others, it was like I'd never existed at all. I walked along the display quietly, hands folded, not touching anything. Guests murmured softly as they passed. One older woman, maybe a friend from her work, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Wasn't he her first husband?" Her husband shrugged like I was part of some forgotten footnote. No one asked who I was. No one offered a nod or a kind word. No one remembered the man who once held her hand at this very altar. There was a slideshow playing, projected onto the wall. Scenes of Evelyn's life, set to soft music. Milestones, birthdays, her second wedding, charity work, and near the end, several clips of her and Michael. Mother and son, arm in arm, the perfect team. I watched quietly, not jealous, just hollow. It wasn't just that I wasn't mentioned, it was the precision of my removal. Entire decades of her life had been rewritten. A whole marriage, a whole chapter, gone. Even when Michael gave his speech, standing tall at the pulpit, his voice calm, composed, he spoke of her strength, her second husband, their foundation, her battle with cancer. But not one word about the years before. Not one word about the man who once watched her carry their child in her arms. Not even a vague acknowledgement of the life we had shared. It was as if I had died long before she did, and maybe to them I had. When the service ended, people filtered out slowly, hugging each other, exchanging quiet words and promises to keep in touch. I remained seated, giving space, giving time. Michael walked by me once. He looked straight ahead, didn't pause, didn't even nod. That's when it hit me hardest. Not that he was angry, not that he hated me, but that he had no space left in his heart to even acknowledge my existence. And that's something deeper than anger, it's dismissal. I stayed until the candles were nearly burned down. I walked out last. There was no thank you, no invitation, no recognition. But as I stepped outside and looked up into the darkening sky, I whispered, "I was here, Evelyn. Whether they know it or not, I was here." And somewhere deep inside me, something stirred. Because even though they tried to erase me from her story, I had a feeling Evelyn left a few pages untouched. Pages only I would be able to read. Michael was 16 when the silence between Evelyn and me finally broke into pieces, too sharp to hold together. The divorce papers were signed quietly, without screaming or scandal. No custody battles, No courtroom drama. Just two people who had grown too tired to keep pretending that love alone could fix everything. She kept the house, the same two-story place with the creaky stairs and the backyard where Michael learned to ride his bike. It made sense. He was still in high school. He needed stability. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, with thin walls and a view of nothing. It wasn't a punishment. It was just what had to happen. I told Michael I'd be there every weekend, every Thursday night dinner, every birthday. I tried. But the phone stopped ringing. The visits grew sparse, and I felt him slipping through my fingers inch by inch, week by week. At first I blamed the awkwardness of divorce. It's hard for a teenager to straddle two worlds when his own is already unraveling. I thought he just needed time. But time passed, and things didn't get better. They calcified, hardened. Years later, I found out why. Evelyn, in her hurt, in her own version of grief, began retelling our story. Quietly, subtly. She didn't call me names or rage to our son. Number, she was smarter than that. Her words were careful, measured. He's busy these days. He moved on. He chose a different life, and Michael listened. Because why wouldn't he? She was the one who packed his lunches, showed up at his games, kept the house full of warmth. I was the one who faded into absence. He never saw how often I drove by just to make sure the lights were on. He didn't hear the messages I left that went unanswered. He didn't read the birthday cards that came back unopened. All he saw was a man on the outside, a shadow, so he began to paint me that way in his mind, as the man who gave up, the one who walked out. And Evelyn, maybe without even realizing it, let that version grow. Maybe it made things easier for her. Maybe she needed to believe that I had stopped caring so she could stop hurting. Or maybe she just didn't know how to explain that sometimes two people break not out of hate, but because the weight of trying becomes too much. The damage, though, was done. By the time he graduated college, I wasn't even invited. Photos of his milestones never came to me. I found out about his wedding from an old neighbor who saw it on Facebook. He built a new life, one that didn't include me. And the strangest thing is, even then, I didn't stop loving him. Even when he cut me out completely. Even when he told others that I was just a biological connection. I wanted to believe that one day he'd come back. That the truth would reach him somehow. That maybe Evelyn would tell him before it was too late. But now she was gone. And the divide between us felt more permanent than ever. Still, part of me hoped, desperately, irrationally, that something of her final words might crack the lie open. That maybe in the will, in a letter, in even a few lines scribbled in a notebook, the truth of who I had been would finally surface. Because love doesn't disappear just because people do, and neither does truth, no matter how long it's been buried. A week passed, 7 long, quiet days where the world moved on like nothing had changed. Evelyn was gone, the service was over, the flowers were wilting, and I was still here, sitting at the kitchen table of a home that had never known her, holding on to memories that no longer had a place to land. I told myself that closure didn't matter, that I didn't need recognition or a place in her obituary or a seat at her son's table. I tried to convince myself that love could exist quietly, without thanks, that showing up in her last years had been enough, that it had been for her, not for me. But deep down, buried under layers of denial and carefully rehearsed dignity, was a question that refused to leave me alone. Did she remember me? Not just as someone from a past life, but as a man who never really left her side. On the 8th morning, a letter arrived, thick envelope, cream paper, a law firm's seal pressed into the back like a stamp of finality. I held it for a long time before opening it. I read the name twice. Yes, it was for me, from her attorney. Inside was a simple note. You are invited to the reading of Evelyn Grace Whitmore's will. Presence required. Wednesday, 10 a.m. There was no warmth in the words. No hint at why I had been summoned, just clinical precision. But my hands trembled, not because I expected an inheritance. I had never expected money. I had never once asked her for anything. No. What shook me was the thought that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't erased me after all, that somewhere within the final legal words of her life, there might be a whisper of acknowledgement, a thread of truth, a line that said, "He was here. He mattered." Wednesday came slowly. I barely slept the night before. My mind raced in every direction. What if she'd left me something symbolic? A letter? A photo? What if she'd said nothing at all? What if my son, standing there in his tailored suit, full of certainty and disdain, watched me walk into that office like a fool, expecting something I had no right to? But I went, not for money, not for closure, but because after years of being written out of my own story, I needed to see if Evelyn had left me a page. The law office was high-rise and sterile, with glass doors and gray furniture that smelled faintly of polish and detachment. A young woman at the front desk pointed me to the conference room. He was already there, Michael, clean-cut, composed, sitting with one leg crossed over the other, scrolling through his phone as if this day was no heavier than a business meeting. He barely glanced at me when I walked in. The lawyer, an older man with kind eyes and a calm voice, entered next, carrying a folder thick with documents. He greeted us both, but only one of us was acknowledged in return. I sat down slowly, unsure what I was about to hear. Was I here as a courtesy? Was there a mistake? Or had Evelyn truly remembered? The lawyer cleared his throat, opened the folder, and began. Her final words, legal, binding, unchangeable, were about to be read aloud. And in that moment, my heart wasn't racing because I wanted something from her. It was racing because for the first time in years, I was about to find out if I had ever really left her heart. I pushed open the polished oak door and felt the chill of the air conditioning hit me like a rebuke. The conference room was minimalist. A long glass table, 10 high-back chairs, and a muted gray carpet that swallowed sound. A single window looked out onto a bustling cityscape. But inside this room, time felt suspended. Michael occupied the chair at the head of the table, his posture rigid, arms crossed like armor. His tailored suit was pristine, the fabric smooth and expensive, an unspoken signal that he belonged here more than I ever would. He glanced up as I entered, his lips curling into a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the same expression he wore when he believed he had all the cards. The lawyer, Mr. Harding, stood near the far end of the table, glancing between his notes and us, as though unsure which of his clients required more reassurance. His crisp suit and gentle manner were meant to put us at ease, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He'd clearly never navigated a room so cold with family ghosts on either side of him. I moved slowly, as if the distance between the door and my seat was measured in miles of memory. Past birthday parties and whispered goodnights, past moments when Michael had clung to my hand in the dark, trusting me to protect him. All of that felt alive in me, vivid and raw, even as I walked into this place where I was unwelcome. My seat was the one directly across from Michael. I sat down with deliberate calm, placing my hands flat on the table, feeling the smooth glass vibrate beneath my palms. The city noise fell away. It was just the three of us in this hermetically sealed moment. A father seeking truth, a son craving power, and a lawyer caught between duty and discomfort. Michael leaned back, tucking one foot beneath his other knee. The posture mocked me, as if this inheritance were his by right, and my presence here was an intrusion. I could almost hear the echo of Evelyn's laughter from years ago, contrasting sharply with the hollow tension that now ruled her final testament. The lawyer coughed softly, clearing his throat. "Shall we begin?" His voice was polite, but his eyes flickered. He was uneasy with the script he was about to read. He adjusted his glasses and opened the folder, revealing pages thick with her careful handwriting, transcribed into legal prose. Michael sneered under his breath. "Don't get your hopes up," he muttered. It landed in my chest like an icy slap. I wanted to lean forward and remind him that hope had carried me through chemo suites and lonely nights. That hope was why I helped her, even when it cost me fragments of my own pride. But I stayed silent, and in that silence I felt something shift. The coldness around me, Michael's judgment, the sterile room, could not freeze the warmth of her memory. I closed my eyes for a moment, recalling her voice in the kitchen as she laughed at one of my bad jokes. The light in her eyes when she called me by my old nickname, the way she reached for my hand when fear crept in. I opened my eyes again, fixed on Michael. His smirk wavered ever so slightly. The lawyer cleared his throat once more, lips parting to speak Evelyn's final words. But in that breath before he began, I understood. This wasn't just a reading of assets. It was a reckoning, a moment when the story she'd rewritten through years of pain would collide with the truth she'd hidden in plain sight. And as the lawyer finally spoke, his voice steady now, I felt the room grow warmer, not because of what I might receive, but because of what I was about to discover. Evelyn had the last word in this cold room, and it wasn't my son's sneer. It was her truth. The lawyer's voice trembled only once, on the name of the beach house, then steadied as he dove into the cold calculus of inheritance. The room seemed to contract around us, the air thick with expectation and dread. I could feel Michael shift in his seat, that smug confidence settling deeper into his bones. He believed this moment belonged to him, every inch of it, every word that would fall from the lawyer's lips. He spoke of stocks acquired over decades, of rental properties in sun-soaked towns, of art collections that whispered of a life more vibrant than most could ever imagine. Each asset was cataloged with unnerving precision, numbers and addresses and titles that formed a monument to Evelyn's ambition and sacrifice. I realized then how hard she had worked after our divorce, how fiercely she had built something for our son, believing he would carry it forward as her legacy. And then the lawyer paused, flipping a page. His finger settled on a passage that felt like a punch to the gut. To my son, Michael, I leave the beach house in Santa Marina and a trust fund of $3 million, to be held until his 35th birthday. Michael's grin blossomed, triumphant and heavy with entitlement. His chest expanded as if the words themselves had filled him with air. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and derision, as though I were watching a game I didn't understand. I closed my eyes for a moment, tasting the sharp tang of disappointment. It wasn't envy that burned inside me. It was something sharper, a realization that even in death, Evelyn's love for him had been measured in dollars. The beach house she had dreamed of sharing with both of us now belonged solely to the son she'd raised after I supposedly walked away. Her generosity felt tainted by the lie that had driven us apart. But there was more. The lawyer continued, reading on, listing charitable endowments in Evelyn's name, scholarships for students pursuing medical research, the causes she held dear. She had given away half her estate, scattering seeds of hope in the world. Michael sat forward, his eyes still glinting, but a flicker of something unreadable passed across his face as he listened to the part of her legacy that didn't benefit him. I felt the weight of her choices settle around me. The beach house and trust fund burned with a kind of unfair brilliance, but the scholarships and medical grants spoke of something deeper, her belief in life beyond loss, in healing beyond money. She had poured her resources into futures she would never see, trusting strangers more than the son who had shut me out. And then as the lawyer turned another page, I caught the corner of a separate section, one not meant to be shared yet. He hesitated, glanced at Michael, then at me, as though uncertain whether to continue. In that pregnant silence my heart thundered, certain that Evelyn had saved the best for last. The cold edge of betrayal cut sharper when the moment stretched too long, and every second throbbed with possibility. The lawyer cleared his throat, steeling himself, and resumed. But my mind was no longer in that antiseptic room. I saw Evelyn's hands trembling as she wrote, her pen carving out lines of remembrance. I heard her voice whispering in the night, begging the universe, let him know. The truth was coming, it had to. And when it did, it would shatter the neat distribution of wealth and entitlement Michael thought was his alone. Because in the end, Evelyn's final act wasn't a gift of money. It was a revelation of who she had seen in me all along, a husband who stayed, a father who loved, a presence she could not erase. And that truth, when it emerged, would outweigh every trust fund and beach house combined. The moment the lawyer's tone shifted, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. His voice, once clinical and steady as he catalogued every asset, now caught in his throat. "And to my former husband, David," he read, and the single word echoed like thunder in my chest. Michael's smug composure fractured. He jolted in his chair, eyes widening as if the ground beneath him had given way. There was no turning back now. My heart pounded so loud I thought he might hear it over the glass table's impassive surface. The lawyer swallowed, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple, and went on. "I leave the following for reasons he will understand." His finger hovered over a separate section of the document, and then he looked up, hesitating in that pregnant pause as though the next words carried more weight than all the rest combined. "There's a letter." That single revelation, a letter, felt like the slow release of a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The air in the room grew denser, charged with anticipation and dread. I imagined Evelyn's hand trembling as she sealed that envelope, the careful scrawl of my name in ink that still bore the faint scent of her perfume. I remembered the nights she'd murmur my name in the dark, not as a memory, but as a lifeline. And now, in this sterile office, that same name felt sacred, resurrected from the ruins of years. Michael sat frozen, disbelief etched on his face, the trust fund's promise crumpling in his mind. He had thought this day was his coronation, but instead he faced a reckoning. I, on the other hand, felt a surge of warmth, as if those unspoken words had been whispered directly into my soul. The lawyer reached into the folder and withdrew an envelope plain, cream-colored, edges softened by time. Every second of silence held the weight of a confession, a forgiveness, and a love that had survived betrayal and distance. When he finally placed it before me, I closed my eyes, letting the moment crystallize. My son stripped of certainty, the lawyer's hands trembling, and the name I carried still echoing in the room. In that instant, I knew Evelyn had given me something far beyond any material inheritance. The proof that in her final acts, she remembered me, cherished me, and ensured that her last voice would speak my name first. My hands shook as I broke the seal, the envelope's edges whispering against my fingertips like a secret too precious to speak aloud. The paper inside was thick and textured, the handwriting unmistakably hers, loops and flourishes that once filled our calendars with laughter and hope. I unfolded the letter with reverence, as if disturbing its folds might scatter the love it carried. Her words washed over me, each phrase a balm to years of silent pain. She remembered every visit, every trembling knock on her door, every bowl of soup carried across the threshold, with more care than an apology. She recalled the nights I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand through convulsions of fear and nausea, offering the only gift I had left to give, my unwavering presence. In her final testament, she declared that I had brought her peace when the world had turned away. Tears blurred the ink as I read the lines again, feeling the weight of her gratitude settle deep in my chest. She acknowledged the sacrifice I made without expectation, the kindness I extended when it seemed easier to walk away. She wrote that this small token, a letter, was all she could offer now, yet it contained more than any fortune ever could. The affirmation that our story mattered, and that love had not vanished, even when we ourselves had nearly forgotten it. As I folded the letter back into its envelope, I realized that every lie that had driven us apart, every omission that had erased me from her final days, had been undone by these simple words. In that moment, her voice reached across the abyss of regret and grief, stitching together the torn pages of our past. And though the world might still see me as a faded figure in old photographs, I carried her testament in my pocket, a living proof that love endures, that memory survives, and that justice can be as gentle as a handwritten note. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, an almost imperceptible crack in Michael's confidence, like the first tremor before an earthquake. His triumphant grin, once carved so deeply into his face, thinned and vanished as the lawyer's words tumbled out. "She left you the family business." And suddenly the weighted silence of that phrase filled the room, demanding attention. My breath caught as the lawyer's list continued. Stocks in emerging tech firms she believed could change lives. Private accounts she used to fund cancer research. The very ledgers she'd kept throughout her treatments, chronicling not just numbers, but moments of hope and despair. He even held up her battered journal, its leather cover worn at the edges from years of nightly entries. It contained her rawest thoughts, fear, gratitude, remnants of our shared dreams. But then in that pregnant pause the lawyer smiled, a genuine, almost bemused smile. "And the rights to her memoir," he said, voice tinged with astonishment. "It's already been optioned by a film studio." His laughter bubbled up, light and irrepressible, in the hush of the room. It shot through me like warm sunbeams breaking through a storm cloud. Michael's face contorted in outright shock. The certainty he'd worn like armor melted away, leaving him exposed and unsteady. He pressed his palms against the glass table as if trying to hold on to reality itself. The beach house and trust fund were nothing compared to this avalanche of legacy. Evelyn's final gift wasn't confined to bricks or numbers. It was the culmination of her life's narrative, the story she'd lived and survived, now entrusted to me to steward, to protect, and to share with the world. My own heart pounded, a symphony of relief and disbelief. All those years of erasure, of whispered rumors that I had walked away, each lie shattered by her bold declaration of who I was to her. I felt her presence then, as though she stood behind me in that sterile boardroom, her hand on my shoulder, guiding me forward. Michael looked between the lawyer and me, chest heaving, eyes wet, not with tears born of grief, but with the first flicker of understanding. He had thought he'd inherited her life. Instead, he only inherited a fraction. I inherited her voice and vision, every ambition she dared to dream after the worst came for her. The lawyer closed the folder gently and glanced at us both. "She knew you would understand." His words weren't just a legal formality, they were an echo of her faith in me, a faith that had never wavered. In that moment, the room was no longer a court of cold facts and contracts. It became a sacred space where love reclaimed its place, where the truth of a lifetime emerged triumphant. And as I rose from my seat, clutching the folder that contained her most intimate thoughts, I knew that Evelyn's final chapter was only just beginning, one that I would honor with every word I penned, every business decision I made, and every life I touched through the foundation she built. Because the greatest inheritance she gave me wasn't property or money. It was the power of her story and the assurance that even in death, her love would live on. Every page I turned felt like uncovering a buried truth, each line a heartbeat of the woman I thought I knew. The journal's leather cover creaked softly, as if awakening from a long slumber, and the scent of aged paper carried me back to nights we spent whispering of secrets by lamplight. On the first entries, she recalled the early days of our marriage, how we danced in the kitchen to a scratchy record player, how her laughter once filled every corner of that small house. But as I skimmed further, the pages darkened with pain. She wrote of the day her second partner left her standing in a silent living room, the door clicking shut like a verdict. My name appeared there, bold and steady, the hand I placed gently on her shoulder, the quiet words I offered in the hallway, the steadfast presence she clung to when nothing else made sense. I paused at a passage dated 6 months after her diagnosis. She described my bowl of soup arriving at precisely 6 p.m., the steam curling in the frosty air, the way I hovered by her bedside until her eyelids closed each night. "David didn't ask for a promise," she wrote. "He only asked to stay." My chest tightened as I remembered the constant ache of wanting to do more, how I never once thought of compensation or recognition, only of easing her burden. Then came entries about Michael, how his laughter had once brightened those same rooms, how his warm embrace on school mornings had been the sweetest melody. But her tone shifted when she recounted the day he stopped calling. She recorded the hollow look in his eyes when I knocked on their door, the polite nod that masked a lifetime of resentment. He loves her, she wrote, but he has no room for the man she still needs. Her pain radiated from the ink, a silent plea for reconciliation that time never allowed. Page after page the truth unfolded, the nights I read to her when sleep refused to come, the letters I mailed that never found her mailbox, the prayers I whispered on her behalf when fear gripped her heart. The journal was her testament, an unbroken line of honesty that no divorce decree could sever. By the time I reached the final entry, tears blurred the words. She wrote of hope, hope that our son would one day understand, hope that love might outlast loss, hope that I would carry her light forward. In those pages I found more than memories. I found her enduring faith in me. And as I closed the journal, I realized that Evelyn's real legacy wasn't in properties or funds, but in the raw, unvarnished truth she entrusted to me. Truth inked in midnight hours when only love dared to speak. Michael's face went crimson, veins pulsing at his temples as the words lodged in the air between us. "You manipulated her," he roared, voice cracking with years of buried rage and confusion. His fist pounded the glass table, rattling the coffee cups and sending papers fluttering like wounded birds. The lawyer rose slowly, placing himself between us with a calm that belied the tremor in his hands. "No," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "She saw who showed up when it mattered." He gestured toward me, across the room. He never left her side. The room contracted in that silence that followed an invisible weight pressing in on all of us. Michael's chest heaved, his breath ragged, as though the truth had struck him like a physical blow. The veneer of his certainty cracked, revealing a boy who had longed for a father's embrace but found only absence. He stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor with a shriek that echoed off the walls. His eyes shot from the lawyer to me, blazing with a fury born of heartbreak and betrayal. For a moment, I saw the little boy he once was clutching my hand in the hospital corridor, trusting me to be his anchor in a storm. That boy's voice was lost now beneath years of misunderstanding, but in Michael's shout I heard its echo. Without another word, he stormed from the room, the door slamming behind him with the force of a verdict. The city sounds beyond the window crept back into the space, indifferent to the rupture that had just occurred. I remained seated, chest heaving, the lawyer's eyes on me with unspoken sympathy. For the first time in our fractured history, Michael was powerless. Not because of money, not because of a will, but because he stood before the irrefutable record of a woman's heart, and in that truth his anger found no target. The inheritance he had coveted meant nothing in the face of Evelyn's testament to love. Alone with the lawyer now, I felt a rush of sorrow for my son's pain, for the walls that fear and misunderstanding had built between us. Yet beneath that sorrow lay a tremor of hope. If truth could cut so deeply, it could also heal. For Evelyn's final act had been not just to vindicate me, but to free Michael from the lie that had bound him. I rose, brushing errant papers from my sleeve. The room was silent, save for the hum of the city. I carried Evelyn's letter and journal close to my heart, their weight both burden and blessing. Outside the door, I could almost hear Michael's footsteps receding down the hallway, angry, hurt, but at last confronted with the truth. In that stillness, I whispered her name, Evelyn, and felt her presence beside me. Her love had compelled me here. Her truth had shattered our divide. And now, as I stepped forward to follow my son into that corridor, I carried not just her legacy, but the promise of redemption for us both. I followed Michael into the hallway, heart pounding with a mix of grief and resolve. Each step echoed against the sterile walls, But in my mind, I heard only Evelyn's voice, gentle yet insistent, reminding me why I came here. It wasn't for a beach house or a trust fund. It was for a place in her story that no legal document could erase. As I stepped beside my son, I felt the weight of every missed birthday, every unanswered call, every hollow excuse that kept me from him. But standing there with her words fresh in my mind, I realized that inheritance paled beside the treasure she truly left me. The certainty that I had mattered to her until the end. In those final days when life itself slipped through our fingers, she saw me, not as an ex-husband, not as a distant figure from a forgotten past, but as the man who had never stopped loving her, never stopped showing up. I looked at Michael's back, stiff, wounded, uncertain, and felt both sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the years of silence that had widened the chasm between us. Hope because now the truth could begin to bridge it. She hadn't left me money to soothe my pride. She had left me remembrance to heal my heart, and that remembrance was woven into the very fabric of her legacy. In the journal entries that told of midnight vigils, in the letter that spoke of simple kindness, in the memoir, rights that immortalized her voice through mine. Walking beside my son, I sensed that the real inheritance was her memory, alive, unerasable, and more valuable than any sum. In that moment, every injustice, every whispered lie, every moment I felt invisible, melted away beneath the glow of her last testament. Evelyn's final gift was a promise that I would never be forgotten, that our shared story would continue to unfold, not in cold numbers, but in the living tapestry of love reclaimed and bonds restored. And as we reached the glass doors of the law office, I felt a fierce determination stir within me, to honor her by telling that story, to live in a way that reflected her faith in me, and to help my son see the truth she had entrusted to us both. For in remembering her, and in knowing she remembered me, we had received something far greater than any check, the healing power of being truly seen. Taking the helm of the Evelyn Grace Whitmore Foundation felt like stepping into the heart of her dreams. Her vision had always been bigger than herself, funding breakthrough cancer research, supporting families torn apart by illness, lighting small candles of hope in the darkest places. Now, holding the embossed plaque with her name and the Foundation's mission statement, I could almost hear her whispering encouragement, as she once did in hospital corridors and quiet living rooms. The day of the memoir launch arrived with a hushed excitement that reminded me of long-ago book readings we'd attended together. The hall was filled with strangers who had become part of Evelyn's extended family scientists, whose work had been made possible by her generosity, patients whose lives had been touched by her kindness, friends who remembered her laughter. As I stood at the podium, the weight of her legacy pressed warmly upon my shoulders. I opened the pages she had penned with her own hand, the ink still vibrant with her spirit, and began to read. Her words flowed through the hall like a soft tide. Recollections of sunlit gardens, midnight vigils beside hospital beds, the unexpected joy of simple moments shared. With each sentence, eyes glistened, breaths caught, and the air trembled with collective emotion. I felt their tears as though they were my own, each one a testament to the life she lived and the love she inspired. When I paused to let her memories settle into their hearts, there was silence so profound it felt sacred. Then gentle sobs and whispered thank yous rippled through the audience. Afterwards, people approached me with stories of how her scholarship had saved a student's future, how her donation had funded a life-saving trial, how her handwritten note had comforted a daughter facing her own parents' illness. They asked about me, curious about the man who finished reading her story, who had guided her foundation forward. I realized then that they saw me through her eyes, no longer the erased ex-husband, but the quiet force she had described in her final letter. She called me the quiet storm, I said, voice steady but thick with emotion, the one who stayed. In that moment, I reclaimed more than a name or an inheritance. I reclaimed our shared narrative, the chapters of love, sacrifice, and unwavering presence that had defined our life together. And as the audience dispersed, clutching copies of her memoir and shedding tears of gratitude, I understood that Evelyn's true legacy lived not just in funds or buildings, but in the hearts she had stirred and the lives she had changed. Standing there, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight and framed by her smiling portrait behind me, I felt her with me, her faith, her courage, and her endless capacity to see beyond circumstance. In carrying forward her work, I honored the promise she made in ink and spirit, that love, when boldly declared, endures far beyond any loss, and that the quiet storm of steadfast devotion can transform not only one life, but countless others. The lights of the premiere hall dimmed and rose again, revealing the title card that bore Evelyn's name. Months had passed since I first opened her letter, yet it felt like yesterday that her words ignited a fire inside me. Now, here I stood in a tuxedo, no longer an erased footnote in her story, but its very champion watching the film that carried her voice onto the silver screen. As the credits rolled, a hush settled over the audience, quickly replaced by applause so thunderous it shook the rows of seats. Critics' praise unfurled like banners, a masterclass in grace and resilience, an unforgettable portrait of love's quiet power. Evelyn's legacy, brought to life through David's unwavering devotion. Each accolade felt like a gentle affirmation that her story, once confined to a fading journal, had found its rightful place in the world's heart. In the lobby afterward, I watched trailers loop on giant screens, but my gaze kept returning to the image of her smiling face, immortalized against a backdrop of rolling waves and sunlit gardens. Surrounded by strangers who now felt like kindred spirits, I realized that every tear shed, every standing ovation was a testament to her enduring light. Then, amidst the celebration, news rippled through the crowd. Michael had tried to sue the studio, challenging the rights he believed were unfairly secured. It was a futile gesture. He had signed the release without reading the fine print, blinded by the promise of money and the echo of old resentments. His fury was an echo of the past, but this time it held no power over me. I felt only a gentle pity for the son who still fought ghosts of a story he never fully understood. In the center of that bustling hall, I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Mr. Harding, the lawyer whose trembling voice had first brought Evelyn's final testament into our world. His eyes were bright with laughter, genuine and triumphant. He had navigated the cold corridors of law to honor the warm truth of her love, and now he reveled in the victory of justice delivered. I smiled then softly, deeply, because in that moment I understood the full arc of her gift. Evelyn had entrusted me with the final word, the ultimate act of faith in the man she always knew me to be. She had transformed my silence into a roar, my absence into presence, my heartbreak into a legacy that would outlast both our lives. As the crowd spilled into the night, bathed in streetlights and the hum of distant traffic, I looked up at the marquee one last time. There it shone, her story, our story, written in stars for all to see. And even in the midst of celebration, in the glow of cameras and applause, the truest sound I carried in my heart was the echo of Evelyn's laughter, clear, triumphant, and absolutely unstoppable. The woman I once lost had indeed given me the final word, and in the end it was the most powerful inheritance of all.